You need to stay away from that building.
I'm not letting you hide this anymore.
You don't understand what's happening here.
The morning sun was just beginning to cut through the heavy valley fog when the black pickup truck stopped at the end of our gravel driveway. I was out near the barn, throwing hay for the 2 horses we had left, feeling the cold air bite at my face. I watched as 3 men got out, their boots crushing the gravel with a heavy, purposeful crunch. They were local guys, the kind who had stayed in our small town just long enough to realize nobody was coming to hand them a life, so they decided to take whatever they could from everyone else. Led by a guy named Brody, who had spent his entire life using his size to push people around, they walked up toward the porch where my younger brother, Leo, was sitting. Leo is 22, but a childhood fever left him with a mind that moves a little slower than most. He lives for the farm, the animals, and the quiet routine of our daily life. He was holding a small wooden figurine he'd been carving all week, a simple little horse, smiling as he saw them walk up. But I saw the look in Brody's eyes, and my heart chilled. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I just set the pitchfork down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and began walking toward the house, keeping my pace slow and steady. Brody stepped onto the low wooden porch, his heavy work boots leaving dirt marks across the planks my father had sealed by hand before he passed away. Brody didn't ask if anyone was home, and he didn't offer a greeting. He just stood over Leo, blocking the light, his shadow falling completely over my brother's shoulders. Brody said they were here about the northern pasture fence, claiming our timber was encroaching on his family's property line, even though that line hadn't moved in 80 years. Leo looked up, his fingers tightening around his carving, his smile fading into confusion. He tried to explain, in his slow, soft voice, that our father had fixed that fence 3 years ago and that the land belonged to the farm. But Brody didn't want an explanation, he wanted an excuse. With a slow, deliberate kick, Brody struck the leg of Leo's chair. The wood cracked, the chair tilted, and Leo spilled onto the porch floor, his wooden horse skittering into the dirt. Brody's 2 friends laughed, a rough, empty sound that echoed off the side of the barn. Brody leaned down, grabbed the wooden horse from the dirt, and crushed it under his heel until the soft pine snapped into splinters. He told Leo that slow-minded people didn't need to be holding sharp tools anyway. I reached the steps just as Leo's eyes started to fill with tears, not from pain, but from the raw confusion of being hurt by someone for no reason at all. I reached out, took Leo by the hand, and helped him stand up, pulling him gently behind my back. I looked at Brody. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pull my shoulders back or drop into a stance. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands loose at my sides, looking at him with the flat, emotionless focus I had practiced for nearly 8 years in places far away from this valley. Brody looked down at me, taking in my faded denim jacket, my worn work boots, and the mud on my knees. He chuckled, telling me I should take my broken little brother inside before someone got hurt, and that he'd be back on Monday to pull down our fence line whether we liked it or not. I told him quietly that he should leave the property now. He stepped closer, coming right into my personal space, expecting me to flinch or look away. I didn't blink. I just watched his shoulder muscles tighten, reading the slight shift in his balance that told me everything about how he moved. Brody smirked, said I was a feisty little farm girl, and turned to walk back to his truck with his friends, throwing one last glance over his shoulder. What Brody didn't know, what no one in this valley knew except for the local sheriff who held my sealed file, was that 3 years ago, I was sitting in a darkened briefing room halfway across the world, wearing specialized combat gear as one of the few women to ever cross over into high-tier Joint Special Operations support under Naval Intelligence and Naval Special Warfare Command. For 8 years, I wasn't Maya, the girl who grew up feeding chickens and helping her dad haul hay. I was the operator they sent into blind corners when communication lines went dead. I had survived extreme cold, night jumps into dark oceans, and hand-to-hand engagements in tight corridors where a quarter-second delay meant you didn't come home. When my father died suddenly of a heart attack 6 months ago, I turned down a promotion, signed my discharge papers, and came back to the only thing left that felt real, this failing farm and my brother. I had left the violence behind in the dust of foreign operational zones. I wanted quiet. I wanted to hear the wind through the pines and teach Leo how to plant tomatoes. But looking at the splinters of Leo's carving scattered on the porch, I realized that peace isn't something you just find. Sometimes, peace is something you have to defend with absolute, uncompromising force. That evening, the house was quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the gentle scrape of Leo's sandpaper as he tried to start a new wood carving at the kitchen table. His hands were shaking slightly. Every few minutes, he'd look toward the front window, startled by the sound of the wind rattling the glass. I sat across from him, cleaning an old kerosene lamp, watching his hands. He looked up at me, his brown eyes wide and full of unasked questions. He asked me why people were mean when you hadn't done anything to them. He asked if we were going to lose the northern pasture, because that was where the wild blackberries grew, the ones our mother used to pick for pies. I reached across the table, placed my hand over his trembling fingers, and told him that as long as I was breathing, no one was taking an inch of our land, and no one was ever going to push him down again. He smiled a little, trusting me completely, because to him, I was just his big sister who made oatmeal in the mornings and fixed the tractor when the belt snapped. He didn't know about the scars running up my left forearm, hidden beneath my flannel sleeves, or the nightmare that pulled me awake at 3 a.m. every night. Around 9 o'clock, I walked outside to do the final check on the barn. The air had turned bitter cold, presaging an early winter frost. As I approached the barn doors, I noticed something wrong right away. The heavy brass padlock hanging on the latch wasn't secured, it was dangling loose. In my line of work, small details aren't minor accidents, they are indicators of intent. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket, my fingers wrapping around a small, tactical flashlight I always carried. I didn't rush in. I stayed close to the wooden wall, using the shadows to break up my silhouette, moving without making a sound in the dry grass. I reached the side door, pushed it open a fraction of an inch, and listened. I could hear the horses shifting nervously in their stalls, their hooves tapping against the dirt floor, accompanied by the low, muffled sound of voices coming from the back tack room where we kept the winter feed and fuel cans. I slipped inside, moving through the dark barn with total silence. I didn't need light, my eyes had long adjusted to low-light environments, and I knew every square foot of this barn like the back of my hand. In the tack room, 2 men were crouched near our tractor. It wasn't Brody this time, it was his younger brother, Marcus, and another local guy named Trent. Marcus was holding an open gas can, pouring diesel straight over the rear tires of our old John Deere tractor, while Trent was trying to pry open the tool chest where my father kept his custom equipment. They weren't just here to intimidate us anymore, they were here to destroy our livelihood so we'd be forced to sell the land cheap to Brody's family. Anger bubbled up in my chest, hot and fast, but I shoved it down instantly, replacing it with the cold, precise focus that had kept me alive in the field. Emotion makes you slow. Focus makes you dangerous. I stood in the doorway of the tack room, my shadow stretching across the concrete floor under the dim utility bulb hanging from the rafter. I asked them quietly what they thought they were doing. Marcus jumped, spilling gas across his boots, while Trent spun around, pulling a long screwdriver out of his belt and holding it up like a weapon. Trent laughed, trying to hide how startled he was, and stepped toward me, telling me I should have stayed in the house if I knew what was good for me. He lunged forward, thrusting the screwdriver straight toward my shoulder to pin me against the doorframe. He moved like an amateur, slow, wide, leaning all his weight onto his front foot. To me, his movement looked like it was happening in slow motion. Before his arm was fully extended, I stepped inside his reach, my left hand sweeping his wrist aside while my right palm struck his solar plexus with direct, explosive power. The air left his lungs in a sudden, violent gasp. As he doubled over, I stepped around his hip, grabbed his shoulder, and drove him face first into the concrete floor, securing his arm behind his back in a hyper-extended wrist lock before he even realized he'd missed his target. He let out a sharp cry of pain, the screwdriver clattering across the floor. Marcus stared at me, his mouth open, the gas can dropping from his hands and spilling fluid across the dirt. He reached into his coat for a folding knife, his hands trembling as he struggled to open the blade. I didn't give him the time. I released Trent, who was groaning on the floor, and closed the 8-foot distance between Marcus and me in less than 2 seconds. I kicked the knife out of his hand before the blade clicked locked, swept his lead leg, and slammed him against the wooden wall, my hand clamped firmly over his throat, cutting off his airway just enough to make his eyes widen in sheer terror. I leaned in close, my face inches from his, speaking in a voice so quiet and flat it sounded colder than the wind outside. I told him that if he or anyone else ever stepped onto this property again, if they so much as looked toward my brother, I wouldn't just defend my farm, I would hunt them down in the dark where no one could hear them call for help. I loosened my grip just enough for him to swallow, and he nodded frantically, his face pale, gasping for air. I pulled him toward the door, threw him toward Trent, who was slowly dragging himself off the floor, and told them to get off my land before I stopped being nice. They didn't say a word. They scrambled out of the barn like frightened dogs, leaving their truck behind in their hurry to reach the main road on foot. I stood in the dark barn for a long time after they left, listening to the sound of my own steady breathing. I grabbed a bag of sawdust, covered the spilled diesel, and made sure the horses were calm before locking the doors with a heavy steel chain I brought from the house. When I walked back into the kitchen, Leo was still at the table, looking up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. He asked if the noises outside were just the wind. I sat down next to him, smoothed down his hair, and told him that everything was fine, that the wind had passed. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Brody wasn't the kind of man to accept a defeat, especially not from a girl he thought was weak. He was going to come back, and next time, he wouldn't send 2 nervous boys to do a job he thought required real force. The next morning, the valley was covered in a thick layer of frost that glittered under a pale gray sky. I spent the early hours walking the perimeter of the farm, checking the tree line and setting up small, subtle warning indicators, thin lines of fishing wire connected to small metal bells tucked deep in the brush near the access roads. It was a habit I couldn't break, a survival instinct drilled into me through years of living in hostile territory. Around noon, I drove our old pickup truck into town to pick up supplies and buy a new set of wood carving tools for Leo. The small town was quiet, its main street lined with old brick buildings that had seen better days. As I stepped out of the hardware store carrying a small paper bag, I saw Brody standing across the street near the local diner, talking to 2 men I hadn't seen before. They weren't locals, they were heavy, rough-looking men with faded tattoos and the hard, callous eyes of people who made their living through violence. Brody caught my eye, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across his face. He didn't approach me, but he raised his hand and made a slow, deliberate motion across his neck before turning back to his conversation. He thought he was playing a game of psychological warfare. He thought he was building anticipation, trying to make me sweat, trying to break my spirit before he delivered the final blow. What he didn't realize was that I had been trained by the absolute best psychological operations instructors in the world. I knew how fear worked. Fear is just a physical response to an unknown threat. Once you identify the threat, assess its capabilities, and formulate an elimination strategy, fear ceases to exist, replaced entirely by execution. I got into my truck, set the tools on the passenger seat, and drove back to the farm, my mind already calculating distances, terrain advantages, and defensive positions. When I arrived home, I found Sheriff Miller parked near our porch. He was an older man, a longtime friend of my father, with tired eyes and a heavy silver star pinned to his jacket. He stepped out of his cruiser as I pulled up, holding a warm cup of coffee. He looked at me for a moment, then looked toward the barn, his expression heavy with concern. He told me he had received a call from Marcus's father earlier that morning, claiming that I had assaulted his son and Trent without provocation. Miller said he knew Marcus was a liar and that Brody was a troublemaker, but he warned me that things were getting out of hand in the valley. He looked at me closely, his voice dropping to a whisper, and asked if I was doing okay. He said he had read my discharge papers when I moved back, not the redacted parts, but the general file that confirmed my service record. He knew I was capable, but he told me that town politics were complicated, and Brody's uncle was on the county board. He urged me to sell the northern pasture to Brody's family and take the money, saying it wasn't worth fighting over land when I had Leo to protect. I looked Sheriff Miller in the eye and told him that my father had shed his sweat into this ground for 40 years to ensure Leo would always have a safe place to live. I told him that if I backed down now, Brody would never stop. He would take the pasture today, the barn next year, and eventually, he'd drive Leo out of his home completely. Miller sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, knowing I was right. He said he would try to keep Brody on a leash, but he admitted that his department was small, and he couldn't guard our farm 24 hours a day. He told me to be careful, got back into his cruiser, and drove down the long gravel driveway, leaving me alone with the quiet rustle of the surrounding forest. I stepped inside the house, handed Leo his new set of carving tools, and watched his eyes light up with pure joy. He gave me a huge hug, his simple, pure affection reminding me exactly why I was standing my ground. That night, the storm finally hit the valley. Rain slammed against the roof in heavy, deafening sheets, while powerful gusts of wind rattled the wooden window frames. It was the kind of night where sound carried poorly, visibility was reduced to near zero, and conventional help was miles away. Perfect conditions for an assault. At precisely 2:00 m, the thin chime of a bell echoed faintly from the direction of the southern tree line, followed immediately by the dull thud of a boot hitting wet mud. I was already wide awake, sitting on the edge of my bed in my dark room, dressed in dark work pants, a black thermal shirt, and my steel-toed tactical boots. I pulled a pair of heavy-duty leather work gloves over my hands, picked up a sturdy 9-inch hunting knife my father had left me, and slipped down the hallway to Leo's room. Leo was fast asleep, wrapped in his thick wool blankets, completely unaware of the storm or the danger approaching outside. I softly closed his door, turned the key in the lock from the outside, and put the key in my pocket. He would be safe in there, the room had reinforced oak walls and no exterior doors. I walked silently to the kitchen, stepped out the back door into the pouring rain, and let the darkness swallow me whole. My body moved automatically, falling back into the rhythms of night operations. I didn't feel cold, I didn't feel afraid. My heart rate dropped to a steady, controlled 45 beats per minute as my senses opened up, taking in the smell of wet earth, the sound of water dripping from the roof, and the faint, heavy footsteps approaching the barn. There were 4 of them this time. Brody, his 2 hired hand muscles from town, and another man carrying a crowbar. They were moving in a loose line, using weak flashlights that cast long, revealing beams through the pouring rain. Brody was pointing toward the back of the house, directing his men to circle around while he took the front door. They weren't just coming to burn a tractor this time, they were coming to break into the house, terrorize us, and force me to sign over the deed to the northern pasture under threat of violence. I slipped under the porch deck, moving through the mud with total silence, positioning myself right beneath Brody's path. As Brody stepped onto the wet wooden steps, his heavy weight causing the planks to creak, I reached out through the gap in the wooden lattice, grabbed his ankle with a crushing grip, and pulled backward with all my body weight. Brody went down hard, his face slamming into the wet wooden steps with a loud crack. Before he could scream, I slid out from under the porch, stepped over his body, and drove my knee firmly into his lower back, pinning him to the wood while sliding my knife blade right against the side of his neck. The rain poured over us, washing the blood from his split lip down into the cracks of the porch. I whispered in his ear, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain like a razor blade. I asked him if he really thought a few local thugs could scare someone who had spent 8 years surviving in zones where people didn't use crowbars, they used heavy artillery and high explosive ordnance. Brody gasped, his body rigid with fear, his eyes rolling back to look at me in the dark. He stammered out that I was crazy, that his men were going to tear the house apart. At that exact moment, one of the hired hands rounded the corner of the house, holding a heavy iron pipe. He saw Brody pinned to the porch and raised the pipe, rushing toward me with a low growl. I didn't hesitate. I pushed off Brody's back, ducked beneath the heavy swing of the pipe, and closed the distance instantly. I drove a palm strike directly into the man's throat, shifting my weight to execute a sweeping hip throw that slammed him shoulder first onto the muddy ground. Before he could recover, I grabbed his arm, twisted his elbow joint past its natural limit until I heard a sharp crack, and disarmed him in one fluid motion. He screamed in agony, rolling into the mud and clutching his shattered arm. Brody was back on his feet now, stumbling backward toward his truck, his face covered in blood and mud, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. He was breathing heavily, looking at his two hired men lying defeated in the dirt, unable to comprehend how a slender, quiet girl from a small farm had taken down 3 grown, aggressive men in less than 90 seconds. He reached into his coat with a trembling hand, pulling out an old revolver he had stolen from his father's cabinet. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely keep the barrel pointed in my direction. He yelled through the sound of the storm, screaming that he was going to end this, that he was going to take the land no matter what it took. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I walked slowly toward him through the pouring rain, my feet stepping steadily over the wet gravel, my eyes fixed on his trembling hands. I told him quietly that if he fired that gun, he'd better make sure he hit a vital organ, because if he missed, there was no place in this valley deep enough for him to hide from what I would do to him. My voice carried an absolute, unwavering certainty that chilled him to his core. He looked at my eyes, cold, hard, and completely devoid of fear, and realized, for the first time in his life, that he wasn't dealing with a victim. He was dealing with an apex predator who had chosen to live a peaceful life until he forced her hand. The barrel of his gun dipped. His knees shook. Slowly, his fingers loosened, and the heavy revolver slipped from his grip, falling into the wet mud at his feet. Brody sank to his knees, burying his bloody face in his hands, sobbing hysterically as the adrenaline left his body, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated shame. I stepped forward, kicked the revolver far out of his reach into the tall grass, and stood over him in the dark. I told him to get his men into his truck, drive to the hospital, and never let me see his face near this valley again. He didn't argue. He scrambled into the mud, helped his groaning men into the cab of his truck, and sped down the driveway, the vehicle fishtailing wildly on the wet gravel before disappearing into the dark night. I stood alone in the driveway for a long time, the rain washing the dirt from my face and clothes. The storm was slowly beginning to pass, the heavy clouds breaking up to reveal a few distant stars shining softly in the dark sky. I walked back into the house, stripped off my wet boots and heavy gloves, and washed my hands at the kitchen sink. Then, I walked down the quiet hallway, pulled the key from my pocket, and unlocked Leo's door. He was sitting up in bed, holding his newly carved wooden horse, looking at me with a soft, questioning expression. He asked if the storm was gone. I walked over, sat on the edge of his bed, and wrapped my arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. I told him that the storm was completely gone, and that it was never coming back. He smiled, rested his head against my shoulder, and handed me the wooden horse he had spent all evening fixing. It was small, simple, and far from perfect, but it was whole again. Looking at that tiny piece of wood, I realized that true strength isn't about how many battles you can win or how much fear you can instill in others. True strength is the quiet, unbreakable promise to protect the simple, beautiful things in life that make it worth living, the warmth of a home, the laughter of a loved one, and the peace of a place where you truly belong. The morning sun rose bright and clear over the valley, casting a warm, golden light across the northern pasture where the grass was still dripping with morning dew. Leo and I walked out to the barn together, carrying fresh hay for the horses, the crisp winter air feeling fresh and clean against our skin. The land was ours, quiet and undisturbed, exactly as it was meant to be. Sometimes, the quietest people carry the heaviest storms inside them, not to destroy the world, but to protect the few who make it gentle.